I've been journaling pretty consistently for over a decade, or more precisely, 4,785 days. This is my college journal. There is a lot of bad poetry in here. And this is the journal where I brainstormed my dissertation when I was in graduate school. And this is a journal I started a couple of months ago. It's actually addressed to my son. If I dig through these journals, I will find descriptions of falling in love, of breaking up, of going to college, of deciding to go to graduate school, of being depressed. That's a persistent theme in a lot of these journals. I'm also wondering about the big questions in life. What is love? Or does God exist? What is my purpose in life? These were all the kinds of questions that I was trying to answer as I was journaling. But there's a bigger question that I could ask, which is, what have I learned from a decade of journaling? I'll give you a couple of lessons that I've learned from this past decade of journaling, and maybe they will be useful for you. Before we get into those lessons, I want to thank this video's sponsor, MyHeritage. MyHeritage is the leading family history web service. MyHeritage allows you to build a family tree using their suite of tools, and they are trusted by over 90 million users. I've been using MyHeritage to try and build out my family tree, try to understand where I come from. One of the coolest features of MyHeritage is that it will look for overlapping trees with other users. So it will actually let you use other users' works to fill out your trees. I've done so myself actually, and I was able to use a few other users' research to fill out my family tree going back to before 1776. Before using MyHeritage, I had no idea when my family came to the United States, and while I still don't know the exact date, I now know that it was at least before 1776, which is interesting. You also have access to billions of records, which can allow you to find out facts about your relatives that you might have never found out otherwise. I've been showing it off to my dad, who's long been interested in genealogy, and I think I've convinced him to use MyHeritage from now on. If you're interested in learning more about where you come from and the people you are descended from, check out MyHeritage using the link in the description or in the pinned comment below. So thank you again to MyHeritage for partnering with me for this video. And let's go back to talking about journaling. So first of all, I have learned just how fragile my memory is. And it's not as if my journals were totally comprehensive. I have never aspired to document every relevant fact about my life in my journals. I've only ever tried to write about the things that I found important. And still, when I read a journal from a decade ago, I find that I don't remember some of these things. And that's very interesting because it tells me that what is important to me now is not the same as what was important to me then. At the time when I was writing those journals, when I chose to write about something, I was sure that that was the most important thing in my life. And now, it's not even a memory for me. So looking through my journals, I see all of this time that I spent being worried, being anxious, fretting about the future, and more or less it all turned out fine. It did not always turn out like I hoped it would, but it almost always turned out fine. And I forget that I was so worried. So what I'm hoping to do is take this lesson and say, yes, you've forgotten about all of those anxious times in the past where they all turned out mostly okay. So now when I am encountering a new situation with my anxiety, I can say, you know what? This is actually probably just going to be another one of those times that I forget. The second lesson that I learned is that repetition is key. As I look through my journals, I see myself repeating certain ideas, certain principles or rules for life that I want to follow. Now, I was not thinking of this intentionally, but what I realized was that I was repeating the rules that I was consistently failing to live by. And I was actually trying to influence my behavior by changing the way I think and thus changing the way that I act. Marcus Aurelius actually writes about this in his book, The Meditations. Marcus writes, "Your mind will come to resemble your frequently repeated thoughts because it takes on the hue of its thoughts. Dye your mind then with a succession of ideas." Think about the principles that you want to live by. Think about the things that you value, but you don't always pursue. If you use your journal as a place to remind yourself of those values or of those principles, eventually you will begin to dye your mind with them. Your mind will be dyed with those ideas. The character of your thought will start changing. And because our thoughts determine our actions, the way you behave will change. Third, I've learned just how often I change my mind. Many of us like to pretend that we have had the same exact values or principles throughout our entire lives. If we recognize that we haven't had those exact values our entire lives, we like to think that there was a single moment when we converted or when we changed. In reality, the search for truth is much more complicated than this. We have beliefs and values, and those are challenged by our experiences or by facts that we encounter. We try at first to modify those beliefs in order to accommodate these challenges. Sometimes the modifications are so radical that we realize we need to abandon our beliefs, and then we start changing our mind. But it's not always a linear process either. Occasionally, you will actually revert back to older ways of thinking, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. Sometimes also we realize that we've gotten ourselves into contradictory positions where two of our beliefs or values actually conflict. And we have to learn how to live with that contradiction if we're comfortable with it, which mostly we shouldn't be, or we have to find a way to resolve the contradiction. When you look back through your old journals and see how often you have been unsettled or uncertain or have had to change your mind, it should actually change the way you view your own current beliefs. Now, I am not a total skeptic. I believe that we can have knowledge, and I have moral convictions, and I hold on to them. But we have to understand that subtly, deep down, we can say, but if things had gone differently in my life, maybe I would have believed otherwise. This should affect the way that we handle disagreement with the people that we encounter in our lives who believe radically different things than us. We shouldn't abandon our convictions or act as if we don't really disagree or as if the disagreements aren't important. But understanding that we too have changed our minds means that anyone we encounter could be someone we convince, and anyone we encounter could be someone who convinces us. The final lesson that I've learned is that it is the content that matters and not the form. I have tried so many different formats of journaling over my life. I've talked about many of those formats in videos before. Every time I have tried to really commit to a specific format, like bullet journaling, I have failed. In fact, I have a bullet journal from this year. I made it about a month and a half before I just kind of gave up on using that system. The times when I have tried to really commit to a format and then have failed at that format have also been the times where I've taken the longest breaks from journaling. And that's really bad. Journaling is one of those things that we should try to do consistently, if not every day, then at least on a regular basis. If we worry so much about the form of journaling that we find that we are unable to actually journal, then we have let form get in the way of content when content really is what matters. I have lots of advice about journaling. I've talked about it in a number of videos. For instance, I think that it's better to journal by hand. Oftentimes people will then ask me, but is it okay if I journal on my computer? Am I doing it wrong? And while I do think it's better to journal by hand, what I would say is you should do whatever it is that helps you journal consistently. Even if I think it is better to journal by hand, and I do, I don't want to let the form or the method of journaling get in the way of someone else's journaling practice so that they can't reap the benefits. I would say we probably live in a form-obsessed world and a world that actually doesn't care that much about the content. And I want to encourage you to think in the exact opposite terms. Value the practice and value the thoughts that you are having as you are journaling rather than the way you journal or the way that it looks.